The hyperspace calculations were wrong from the beginning, but nobody noticed until we were already committed to the jump, until the Relentless had engaged its hyperdrive, and the stars stretched into lines, and we entered that impossible space between spaces, where the laws of physics become suggestions, and where human consciousness wasn't meant to operate for extended periods. My name is Navigation Officer 3rd Class Ven Saro, and I have been filing incident reports about what happened during that jump for 6 weeks now, writing the same account over and over, while ISB interrogators ask the same questions in slightly different configurations, trying to determine whether I'm lying or insane, or whether I actually witnessed what my reports describe, which is that our Star Destroyer performed a hyperspace maneuver that violated every known principle of astrogation and emerged in a location that shouldn't exist according to any chart in Imperial records. They keep telling me that my story is impossible, that the mathematics don't support the trajectory I've documented, that the destination coordinates resolve to empty space in a region of the galaxy that has been surveyed and catalogued for centuries without revealing anything remotely resembling what I claim to have seen. I keep telling them that I know it's impossible, that I understand the calculations were wrong, that I agree the entire incident violates established principles of hyperspace navigation, but that none of this changes what actually happened, which is that we jumped and something went wrong in ways that shouldn't have been possible, and we ended up somewhere we shouldn't have been able to reach, and now 17 crew members are dead and 23 more are in psychiatric detention, and I'm sitting in this interrogation room trying to explain the unexplainable to people who have already decided that my testimony is either fabrication or evidence of mental breakdown. The mission had been routine patrol assignment in the Outer Rim, standard anti-piracy operations that required more presence than actual combat capability, and the Relentless had been conducting these patrols for 8 months, without incident beyond the occasional engagement with smugglers who were stupid enough to run when they should have surrendered. The crew was experienced, the ship's systems were well maintained, and the command structure was stable under Captain Threnody, who had built a reputation for efficient operations and low casualty rates that made assignment to the Relentless desirable for personnel who wanted to serve their terms without experiencing the kind of trauma that characterized postings to more active combat zones. I had been aboard for 4 months, working standard navigation rotation in the Bridge Operations Center, calculating hyperspace routes and monitoring real space trajectories and ensuring that the ship's movements complied with traffic control protocols and Imperial security directives. The work was technical and demanding, but not particularly dangerous, required precision and attention to detail, but rarely involved the kind of high-stakes decision-making that could result in catastrophic failure if errors occurred. The incident began when we received priority transmission from Moff Terrance's office, directing us to new patrol coordinates in a sector adjacent to our current operations area, coordinates that required hyperspace jump through route that wasn't listed in standard navigation charts, but that the transmission assured us had been cleared by Imperial Survey Corps and was safe for vessels of our class. The transmission included supplementary navigation data, complete set of coordinates and gravitational corrections, and hyperspace beacon frequencies that should have allowed us to plot the route with standard procedures. But when I input the data into the navigation computer, the results were unusual, showed trajectory that bent through hyperspace in ways that didn't match conventional jump geometries, that suggested we would be traveling through regions of compressed space-time that normally required much longer subjective transit times than the calculations indicated. I flagged the anomaly in my preliminary assessment, noted that the trajectory appeared to violate several principles of hyperspace mechanics that I had learned during navigation training, but the flag was overridden by senior navigation officer who explained that the route was using classified Imperial technology that allowed for more efficient hyperspace transits, and that my concerns reflected incomplete understanding of advanced astrogation techniques that were beyond my current clearance level. The explanation was plausible because I knew the Empire maintained classified navigation data and experimental transit technologies that weren't shared with junior officers, knew that my training had been comprehensive but not complete, knew that questioning directives from MOF-level authority was career-limiting behavior that suggested insufficient trust in command hierarchy. So I accepted the override, finalized the calculations according to the provided data, and transmitted the course to the helm for execution. And when Captain Threnody authorized the jump, I monitored the hyperdrive engagement sequence and watched the viewport as the stars stretched, and we entered hyperspace according to the coordinates that I had been assured were safe, despite all my training suggesting they were dangerously wrong. The initial transition felt normal, the characteristic stomach drop sensation of reality shifting around you as the ship moved from normal space into the hyperspace dimension, the slight disorientation that came from consciousness trying to process an environment that human neurology hadn't evolved to perceive. But within seconds, something changed, something that wasn't part of normal hyperspace transit experience, something that made my inner ear feel like it was rotating independently of my skull, and that made the bridge lighting seem to flicker, even though the illumination strips maintained constant output. Other officers noticed it too, the subtle wrongness that pervaded the ship, and I saw the communications officer touch her ear like she was hearing something in her headset that shouldn't have been there, saw the tactical officer stare at his displays with expression that suggested the data wasn't making sense, saw Captain Threnody grip the command chair's armrests with tension that indicated she was experiencing something she didn't want to acknowledge. The ship's intercom system crackled with static that resolved into what might have been voices or might have been audio artifacts from electromagnetic interference, and I heard fragments that sounded like words, in languages I didn't recognize, or maybe in language I did recognize but with pronunciation that made familiar sounds alien and disturbing. The reactor hum that normally provided constant background noise shifted frequency slightly, became rhythm that felt intentional rather than mechanical, became something that my nervous system interpreted as threat, even though I couldn't articulate why a sound frequency should provoke that response. I checked the navigation displays, verified that we were still following the calculated trajectory, confirmed that the hyperdrive was operating within normal parameters, and that the ship's position relative to the hyperspace reference frame was consistent with our intended course. Everything looked correct according to the instruments. But the instruments were measuring things that my direct perception contradicted, were telling me that we were experiencing normal hyperspace transit, while my body and mind were screaming that something was fundamentally wrong with our current state. The discrepancy between instrument readings and experiential reality created cognitive dissonance that made it difficult to trust either source of information, made me question whether the instruments were malfunctioning or whether my perceptions were being distorted by some effect that the instruments couldn't detect. I reported the discrepancy to Senior Navigation Officer, described the subjective wrongness that multiple bridge crew were experiencing, and he told me to continue monitoring and to disregard subjective experiences that weren't reflected in objective instrument data. That hyperspace transit sometimes produced unusual perceptual effects in sensitive individuals, and that these effects had no operational significance as long as the ship's systems remained functional. The directive was standard procedure for dealing with hyperspace disorientation, was consistent with training that emphasized trusting instruments over subjective experience when the two conflicted, But following that directive meant ignoring increasingly severe indications that something was catastrophically wrong with our transit. The voices in the intercom static became more distinct, began sounding like crew members calling for help or reporting emergencies. But when communications checked with the departments that the voices claimed to be from, those departments reported no emergencies and no one had transmitted the messages we were hearing. The tactical displays started showing phantom contacts, ship signatures that appeared and disappeared without following any logical movement pattern that sometimes appeared to be inside our own hull or occupying impossible positions relative to our reference frame. The viewport began showing distortions in the hyperspace field, areas where the normal blue-white tunnel of stretched starlight was interrupted by darker regions that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, regions that appeared to be moving closer to the ship despite our fixed trajectory. Captain Threnody ordered engineering to run diagnostics on all systems to verify that we weren't experiencing some kind of widespread sensor malfunction that was producing the anomalous readings and perceptual effects, and the diagnostics came back clean, showed all systems operating within specifications, showed no evidence of malfunction or damage that could explain what we were experiencing. The disconnect between system performance and experienced reality became more severe as the transit continued, became impossible to ignore or rationalize through normal troubleshooting frameworks, and I saw Threnady's expression shift from concern to something closer to controlled panic as she realized we were in a situation that didn't match any failure mode she had been trained to handle. She ordered me to calculate emergency return trajectory, to plot course that would take us back to our origin point or to nearest safe coordinates, and I worked through the calculations with increasing desperation because the navigation computer was refusing to accept the inputs, was returning error messages that indicated the coordinates I was trying to plot didn't exist or were inaccessible from our current position. The impossibility of the error messages suggested that we had somehow moved outside the normal hyperspace navigation framework, that our position was no longer properly referenced to the galaxy's gravitational structure in ways that would allow standard astrogation techniques to function. And that realization meant we were lost, not in the sense of not knowing where we were, but in the sense of being in location that didn't have stable relationship to the rest of space-time. I reported this to Threnody and watched her process the implications, watched her understand that we might be trapped in hyperspace until our life support failed or until something worse happened, and she made the decision that probably saved those of us who survived, ordered immediate emergency hyperspace dropout despite not knowing where we would emerge or whether forced dropout from anomalous trajectory would damage or destroy the ship. The order violated standard procedure that discouraged emergency dropouts, except in cases of imminent drive failure, but standard procedures assumed you were in normal hyperspace rather than in whatever impossible space we were currently occupying. The dropout was violent in ways that normal transitions weren't, felt like reality was tearing itself apart and then rebuilding incorrectly, felt like my consciousness was being pulled in directions that didn't correspond to any physical dimension I could name, and I experienced a moment of absolute vertigo, where I couldn't distinguish between up and down or between past and future or between myself and the ship around me. Then we were in real space again. The stars were visible through the viewport as discrete points rather than stretched lines, and I was back in my body with sense of having returned from somewhere that consciousness wasn't meant to go. The bridge was silent except for the ambient systems noise, everyone checking themselves and their stations to verify they were intact, and I looked at the navigation displays to determine where we had emerged and found coordinates that meant nothing. That didn't match any location in the comprehensive galactic charts that the navigation database maintained. I ran position verification against every available reference, checked stellar positions and gravitational signatures and background radiation patterns, and none of it matched known locations. We were somewhere in what appeared to be normal space, surrounded by stars that formed unfamiliar configurations, in a region that either wasn't in any Imperial chart or that was so distant from known territories that the stellar positions had shifted enough to be unrecognizable. The sun nearest to our position was wrong color, emitted spectrum that included wavelengths that shouldn't have been present in natural stellar radiation. And when I pointed the ship's sensors at it, the readings showed anomalies that suggested the star's internal fusion processes were operating according to different physical constants than what standard stellar models predicted. The planets in the system, if they could be called planets, had orbits that violated Kepler's laws, that suggested they were being maintained in their positions by something other than normal gravitational mechanics. And when tactical swept the system for threats or navigational hazards, the sensors detected structures that appeared artificial, but that were scale that made no sense. Structures that would have required resources and engineering capabilities that exceeded anything known galactic civilization had achieved. Captain Threnody ordered communications to attempt contact with any stations or vessels in the system, to broadcast standard Imperial identification and request navigational assistance, and the communications officer reported that all standard frequencies were dead, that the electromagnetic spectrum in our vicinity was full of background noise that resembled data transmissions, but that couldn't be resolved into coherent signals using any known encoding protocol. The noise sounded organic when it was played through the bridge speakers, sounded like breathing or heartbeat or something rhythmic that biological systems produced, and listening to it created the same sense of wrongness that had characterized our anomalous hyperspace transit. Threnody ordered the sound disabled, ordered communications to continue attempting contact using pre-Imperial emergency frequencies and protocols that predated current encryption standards, and those attempts produced responses, signals that came from somewhere in the system, and that translated into what might have been words or might have been our translation software finding patterns in random data. The translation said things like, "Why are you here?" and "You should not have come," and "The door is open now and cannot be closed," and other phrases that suggested we were communicating with something that understood our presence was significant, but that wasn't providing useful information about where we were or how we could return to known space. Threnody ordered the communications terminated, ordered the ship to begin systematic survey of the system to gather data that might allow us to identify our location or to calculate return trajectory, and over the following hours we mapped the system and encountered things that made it increasingly clear we were not in any normal region of the galaxy. We're perhaps not in our galaxy at all. We're possibly in location that didn't connect to normal space-time through any relationship that human astrogation science could model. The structures we found orbiting the impossible star were constructed from materials that shouldn't have been stable at normal space-time conditions, were geometries that seemed to fold through dimensions our sensors couldn't properly measure, were clearly artificial but were so alien in their design principles that calling them buildings or ships or installations didn't capture what they actually were. Some of them appeared to be observing us, orienting toward the relentless despite showing no evidence of propulsion or maneuvering systems. And when Tactical attempted to scan their interiors, the sensors returned data that was technically accurate but meaningless, showing spaces that were simultaneously empty and full, showing internal volumes that were larger than exterior dimensions suggested, showing what the analysis algorithms described as topological impossibilities that shouldn't have been returning any sensor echo at all. The crew was deteriorating during this survey, experiencing psychological effects that the medical bay couldn't adequately treat. effects that ranged from anxiety and insomnia to more severe symptoms including visual hallucinations and identity confusion, and what the medical officer described as perceptual fragmentation, where individuals lost ability to distinguish between their own thoughts and external stimuli. 17 crew members died during this period, not from any physical cause that medical examination could identify, but from what appeared to be catastrophic nervous system failure, where their bodies simply stopped functioning while their brain activity went through patterns that suggested they were experiencing extreme sensory overload. The deaths followed pattern that suggested they were being caused by proximity to the structures we were surveying. That looking at them or thinking about them too carefully was creating cognitive load that human neurology couldn't sustain, and Threnody ordered us to withdraw from the system and to prepare for attempted return jump to normal space. I calculated return trajectories using every method I had been trained in, and several I improvised, tried to find any hyperspace route that would take us back to coordinates that appeared in Imperial charts, and everything I attempted failed in the same way the emergency return calculations had failed during our anomalous transit. The navigation computer couldn't locate reference points that would allow it to plot stable hyperspace trajectory from our current position, couldn't find the gravitational framework that astrogation depended on, couldn't even confirm that we were in space-time that connected to the normal galaxy through any accessible route. We were trapped in a region that either didn't connect to the rest of the universe or that connected through pathways that required understanding of hyperspace mechanics that exceeded anything Imperial astrogation science had achieved. And that realization meant we might never return, might be condemned to die slowly in this alien system, while our life support exhausted itself and our minds continued deteriorating from exposure to environment that human consciousness wasn't designed to process. Threnody assembled senior staff to discuss options, and the discussion quickly revealed that we had very few options, and none of them were good. We could remain in the system and continue attempting to calculate return trajectory while our crew continued dying from mysterious neurological failures. We could explore further to search for whoever or whatever had built the structures, attempt to communicate, and potentially request assistance, though the earlier translation attempts suggested that whatever intelligence existed here was not friendly or comprehensible in terms we could work with. Or we could attempt blind hyperspace jump, pick random coordinates and hope that we would emerge somewhere recognizable, though that approach would more likely result in the ship being destroyed or lost even more completely than we already were. The staff discussion became mutual recrimination as stress and fear broke down professional composure, and I watched officers who had been collegial and competent become hostile and paranoid, become people who accused each other of sabotage or collaboration with whatever forces had trapped us here. The paranoia was justified when we discovered that some crew members were not experiencing the same psychological deterioration as the rest, were instead becoming more calm and focused and apparently comfortable in our current situation. And when security investigated these individuals, they found evidence that they were communicating with something, were receiving instructions or information through channels that weren't using the ship's systems, and that seemed to be entering their minds directly. The security investigation revealed that these compromised crew members had been conducting unauthorized experiments with the ship's sensors, had been focusing sensor arrays on specific structures despite orders to minimize observation, and they claimed when interrogated that they were learning things, that exposure to the structures was teaching them truths about reality that they had never understood before, that they were being offered opportunity to evolve beyond their limited human consciousness if they were willing to accept the transformation that the structures were offering. Threnody ordered the compromised crew members confined to detention cells, ordered all sensor activity focused on the structures to cease immediately, and ordered the ship to move to maximum distance from the system's structures while I continued attempting to calculate escape trajectory. The confinement was partially successful, but 3 of the compromised crew members managed to override security protocols and access the ship's systems, managed to activate sensor arrays, and establish direct connection with one of the larger structures. And what happened next is difficult to describe because it violated causality in ways that made normal narrative sequence impossible. The structure that had been observing us from distance was suddenly inside the ship, despite no indication of movement or teleportation, was occupying space in the lower decks while simultaneously remaining in its orbital position outside the ship, and crew members who encountered it in the corridors reported that it was both physical object and absence of object, was something that created space rather than occupying it, was geometry that their eyes couldn't properly focus on and that their minds couldn't properly remember. I know this description sounds like psychotic break rather than legitimate testimony, but I have sensor logs that partially corroborate the events, even though the logs don't make sense when analyzed, show the structure in 2 locations simultaneously, show the ship's hull integrity remaining intact, while portions of the interior were apparently open to vacuum, show crew members who were recorded as dying in the initial incident now appearing in new locations conducting activities that their documented deaths should have made impossible. The ISB interrogators have examined these logs repeatedly and keep telling me that they show evidence of data corruption rather than genuine anomalies, that the impossible readings are artifacts of sensor malfunction rather than accurate documentation of what occurred. But I was there on the bridge watching the tactical displays, and I saw the structure inside our ship while simultaneously monitoring its position in the orbital survey data, and both positions were real in ways that made it clear that the structure existed in more dimensions than our sensors could fully represent. Threnody made the final decision that saved some of us, ordered immediate evacuation of the affected sections and emergency core separation to isolate the structure in the aft section of the ship, while the command section attempted emergency hyperspace jump, regardless of having viable coordinates. The separation was catastrophic, resulted in deaths of everyone in the aft section and severe damage to the hyperdrive systems, but it removed the structure, or at least removed the portion of it that was manifesting in our space-time. And when I calculated emergency jump trajectory using whatever coordinates the damaged navigation computer could still access, we engaged the compromised hyperdrive and transitioned back into hyperspace, despite having no confidence that the transit would take us anywhere useful, or that we would survive it. The transit felt wrong in the same ways the original anomalous jump had felt wrong, but more intensely. Felt like we were moving through space that was actively hostile to our presence, space that was trying to reject us or dissolve us or transform us into something that could exist in this environment without contradiction. The dropout occurred after subjective time that might have been hours or days or weeks, impossible to gauge because time perception becomes unreliable during hyperspace transit and becomes more unreliable during anomalous transit, and when we emerged, we were back in normal space, in a system that was listed in Imperial charts, system in the outer rim that was far from our original position, but that was recognizably part of the known galaxy. The ship was barely functional, the hyperdrive was destroyed beyond repair, life support was operating at minimal capacity, and the surviving crew was traumatized in ways that would require years of treatment, if treatment was even possible. We broadcast emergency signals and were retrieved by Imperial patrol within 36 standard hours, and then the interrogations began. The incident reports and the testimony and the psychiatric evaluations and the ISB's determination that something had happened, but that the something couldn't be officially acknowledged, because acknowledging it would require admitting that Imperial navigation protocols had directed us into region of space that shouldn't have been accessible and that contained things that shouldn't have existed. I have been told that my incident reports will be classified at levels that ensure they will never be widely read, that the official explanation for the Relentless's damage and casualties will cite catastrophic hyperdrive malfunction rather than unauthorized transit to impossible location, that the surviving crew members will be reassigned to positions where their testimonies about the incident will not be credible if they attempt to discuss what happened. I have been informed that continuing to insist on the accuracy of my testimony will result in my classification as psychologically unfit for service and potential detention for psychiatric treatment that will continue until I accept the official explanation or until I am no longer considered security risk. I am recording this final confession before accepting the treatment, because someone needs to know what actually happened, needs to understand that the hyperspace jump that broke every known Imperial rule didn't just break rules, but broke reality in ways that revealed there are places in the galaxy where the normal laws don't apply, and where human consciousness encounters things it wasn't designed to survive encountering. The navigation data that directed us to that impossible system came from Moff Tarrant's office, but the investigation revealed that no one in that office had transmitted the data, that the transmission appeared to have originated from Imperial command infrastructure, but that no one within that infrastructure had authorized or generated it. Someone or something had accessed Imperial systems and inserted false navigation data that was designed to send us to that location, and that insertion suggests the encounter was not accident, but deliberate manipulation by intelligence that understands Imperial communication protocols and that wanted us to discover what exists in that system. The ISB is investigating the security breach, but I suspect they will not find its source, because the source likely exists in the same category as the structures we encountered, likely exists in space that doesn't connect to normal reality through relationships. Our security systems can monitor or control. I am ending this recording now and preparing to accept the psychiatric treatment that will either restore my official reliability or render me incapable of repeating these claims in ways anyone will believe. The hyperspace jump that broke every known Imperial rule also broke something in how I understand reality. Broke my confidence that the laws we believe govern the universe are actually comprehensive rather than just being local conditions that don't apply in regions where other forces operate according to different principles. I spent 4 months on the Relentless, believing I understood navigation and hyperspace mechanics and physical law, and then I experienced transit that revealed how little any of us understand about what exists in the spaces between spaces, what ancient things might be observing us from locations that exist outside the frameworks we use to map and comprehend the galaxy. The Empire believes it controls space through military presence and navigation charts and bureaucratic administration. But what we encountered suggests that control is illusion, maintained only in regions that have not yet attracted attention from things that exist in the deeper layers, things that view our presence not as conquest, but as intrusion into territories we were never meant to access, and where the rules we depend on simply do not function,